Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you to the Mining History Association for inviting me to give this address. Thank you to all involved in organizing it. It's been a wonderful conference. I'm delighted to be back in Pittsburgh. Thank you to Kelly for introducing me. Kelly's from Jasper County, Missouri. Is that right, Kelly?
Yes, Carthage.
Yeah, Carthage. I went to college in Joplin, Missouri Southern in Jasper County, and nobody's really talked about it yet, but between Missouri Southern and Pittsburg State University, we have what I would call a lovingly bitter rivalry. That's played out on the sports field. The annual football game is known as the Miners Bowl. So we have coal miners versus lead and zinc miners. And I must say, as a Missouri Southern alum, with great shame and disgrace, that Pittsburg State usually wins that game every year. They have a dynamite football program. But I would say in other sports, basketball, softball, baseball, Missouri Southern holds their own. Right now, Missouri Southern's women's softball team is in the College World Series. The Pittsburg State Gorillas are not. Yeah, I could keep going. I could just give a talk about that rivalry. But I'm really excited to be talking about Poor Man's Fortune to you all. It came out in May 2020, which if you can roll back your memories to May 2020 and what that was like, it wasn't a lot of fun. We were in the depths of COVID at that moment. And so because of that, I never actually got to give an in-person talk about the book. This is the first time I've been able to do that. So I'm really excited to do it. Really excited to do it here, in what I consider home, even though it's Kansas and Pitt State. I do consider it somehow home. Okay. Put the cover up for you. This book, by the way, published by the University of North Carolina Press, available from all booksellers, good and bad. But I would say also that the digital copy is always available as open access, thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities in all platforms. But I'm going to start with Charles Moyer. And before I get started, I will say that I'm going to use the terms Joplin miner and tri-state miner in this talk somewhat interchangeably. Although for the bulk of the period I'm talking about, the district was known as the Joplin District. Much of this history happens before the discoveries in Oklahoma makes it formally a tri-state district. But I'm going to use those terms interchangeably here. So miners from around Joplin, Missouri, which is the center, what will become known as the tri-state district, haunted this man, Charles Moyer, a former miner from Leeds, South Dakota, and longtime president of the Western Federation of Miners. The Western Federation, a radical union of metal miners that gave rise to the Industrial Workers of the World, and later the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. Between 1896 and 1910, miners from the zinc and lead fields in Jasper, Newton, and Lawrence counties, Missouri, and in Galena, Cherokee County, Kansas, worked willingly and enthusiastically as strikebreakers. Nearly every place the Western Federation struck. They're striking for better conditions, for higher wages, from Leadville, Colorado, to Jerome, Arizona, to the South Dakota Black Hills, to Northport, British Columbia. In each place, Joplin miners helped some of the richest mining corporations in the world defeat the Western Federation, defeat the labor movement. Moyer was especially confounded because Southwest Missouri miners rejected union organizers who went to Joplin, who went to Webb City, who went to Granby and Galena, in the hopes of convincing them that working class solidarity was better than strike breaking. By 1910, when Southwest Missouri miners broke a big strike in Lead and Deadwood, South Dakota, the Western Federation had few followers around Joplin, essentially no organizing gains after a decade of attempts aided by the Missouri State Federation of Labor. It has been difficult to understand, Moyer admitted at the Western Federation's convention that year, why these workers, surrounded as they are by organized labor, seeing and realizing its benefits, should stand aloof, ever ready to sell themselves to the employer for the purpose of assisting him in wresting from their fellow miners conditions which have cost them years of determined effort to build. The unorganized of Missouri are always with us, Moyer complained. For decades, miners from the Joplin area baffled and outraged observers who struggled to understand them. In 1900, union miners called them, quote, bums and thugs, a dangerous class. To a mining engineer in 1910, they were, quote, sullen and violent. In 1919, a social worker found them almost unapproachable with a social outlook that he called distinctly hideous. Another organizer around Joplin called Joplin the hardest town to organize he had ever got into. In the local slang of northern Idaho, where several hundred miners had gone to break a strike in 1901, the word Missourian meant scab or cut-rate laborer. And I found this in a dictionary of northern Idaho slang. You look up Missourian, the definition, scab or cut-rate labor. To others, they were miserably and cowardly. Joplin was a, quote, scab incubator for men, quote, dead to all sense of honor and manhood. Another organizer summed them up in a single word, deplorable. And I quote, deplorable. We got some cheering over here. Is this an anti-Joplin section? Okay, all right. I'm right there with you. These miners also troubled people closer to home. Beginning in the 1880s, they rejected the public policy measures that Missouri labor unions fought for, including laws on safety, the 8-hour day, and public health. This obstinance had serious effects on their communities, most tragically in some of the highest rates of tuberculosis, morbidity, and mortality in the United States. And by the 19-teens, an epidemic of silicosis, a deadly occupational lung disease caused by mine dust in the chert-rich formations of the sheet ground. In 1914, the Webb City Register gave an explanation that unconsciously echoed union commentators elsewhere. Area miners gave, quote, little consideration to their personal health and were the least interested in safety measures in the mine. The reason, the paper asserted, was bad habits born of ignorance or carelessness. I'm a labor historian. That's how I got interested in this. And labor historians, as a group, offer little more by way of explaining the actions of these miners. As a group, we have told organizing stories of how different workers banded together to improve working conditions, to claim rights, to challenge employers and the states, miners and their unions, whether in coal, and I think the Southeast Kansas coal miners are a great example of this, or metal, have often been at the center of the story that labor historians tell. Right? Miners' unions are the vanguard of the labor movement. We know that the impediments these workers struggled against to form unions, to build a labor movement, are often seen as external and received, often from elite sources, whether fear and vulnerability, legal obstacles, or often ideas about racial division trumping class-based unity. Yet we also know that workers across the United States overcome these encumbrances. Again, Southeast Kansas coal is a great example of that. Only partially to perceive and act upon common interests. This literature rests on an assumption that workers would organize into unions if they could. That assumption runs on a faith in what labor historians have called mutualism. And so legendary labor historian David Montgomery has articulated this idea best. He wrote that workers in industrial America developed, quote, an ideology of mutualism that taught workers that the only hope of securing what they wanted in life was through concerted action. Everything in the lives of working people, Montgomery argued, all attachments, tied them to this ideology. Conversely, he concluded, the ideology of acquisitive individualism, which explained a society justified a society regulated by market mechanisms and propelled by the accumulation of capital, could have no purchase on people who owned only their labor. It's hard to see tri-state miners in Montgomery's formulation. So what if their interests weren't what we think they should have been? What if their interests weren't the broad terms of Montgomery's mutualism? Rather than ask why they did not support unions and government reform, maybe we should ask, what did they support? How did they understand and explain their own actions? These questions require us to look again at Montgomery's formulation. What if, rather than being naturally opposed to the modern capitalist dynamic, production for sale in markets, the pursuit of individual economic incentives, what if tri-state miners embraced it? When it comes to understanding tri-state miners and others like them, I would argue that we have been asking the wrong questions. In Poor Man's Fortune, my really decade-long effort to understand these miners, I argue that across at least 4 generations, from the 1850s to the 1920s, they maintained a faith in the transformative powers of capitalism. They did so despite large-scale industrial change, the rise of national mining unions, and the halting creation of legislation granting workers legal protections. Although this long arc suggests continuity, Joplin miners constructed an understanding of capitalism over time in response to often sharp social and cultural change. Their faith was not only economic, miners defined, refined, and defended a concept of working-class entrepreneurialism that increasingly privileged the risk-taking prerogatives of native-born, physically assertive white men. They registered any limitation to those chances as threats to be resisted, in the process hurting many others and eventually themselves. Even when the promise of capitalism failed in the depths of the Great Depression, this lineage of ideas and certainties would dominate the last gasp efforts to make tri-state mining communities decent places to work and live. The first key, I've got 3 keys. The first key to understanding Southwest Missouri miners is that they believed in the possibilities of capitalism for good reason. It had delivered for them via the immense advantages open to white, especially native-born men, in an era of settler expansion. From the first mines in the 1850s to the 1880s, men with little capital formed working partnerships to lease land in this relatively isolated area, leaseholds that gave them access for up to 5 to 10 years, beginning at Granby, which is pictured here, but gradually expanding to create the communities that are still there. Granby's still there too. Oronogo, Webb City, Carterville, Joplin, galena. With few machines, they mined lead and zinc for their own profit in exchange for royalty payments of 10 to 20% to the landowner. This was possible because of the district's geology and the economics of base metal mining. And also because it was relatively easy for white men to freely negotiate such terms, leasehold terms, in this isolated backcountry. Leasehold miners pursued irregular, fragmented, surface mineral deposits in shallow mines 20 to maybe 80 feet deep at the most in this early period. Their success with human and animal power made investments in mechanized operations, like those in deeper western mines, unnecessary. The absence of precious metals in the area also forestalled mechanization and large outside investments. Miners had to sell lead and zinc by the ton to make as much as others earned selling gold and silver by the ounce. Their timing, though, was great. The price of both base metals increased for most of the 19th century. Lead went into pipes, bullets, and paint, zinc into brass, galvanized metals, and also paint. By 1900, in an industrializing economy where more and more things are made out of metal, rust-resistant paint is very important. By 1900, Southwest Missouri miners led the nation in the production of zinc and ranked third in the production of lead. They made Joplin a significant center in the zinc industry. By the early 20th century, Joplin markets set the base price for zinc concentrate in the United States. The success of leasehold miners as owner-operators earned the district a reputation as a poor man's camp, where men who had little else than an appetite for risks and hard work could make good money. At a time when most landless workers faced dependence on wages, they enjoyed a rare opportunity to enter market commerce with control over their own labor and claims to its profits. This opportunity required them to assume all the physical and financial risks of mining. Miners called their leasehold contracts jug handles. Imagine, we talked a lot about moonshine in this conference. Imagine a moonshine jug, right? It's a jug handle. The risk is all on one side, theirs. Most partnerships hired one or two wage workers to help in the diggings. These wage workers in turn saved their money to set up for themselves to dig their own mines. For 4 decades, 40 years, remarkably, it's a remarkably long time, they could do that. Right? That worked. The poor man's camp attracted thousands of miners, many from older mining districts in Wisconsin, Illinois, and eastern Missouri, others from farms across the border west. Most were native-born white men who arrived in family groups, although some foreign-born and black miners were present before the 1880s. These were dynamic communities focused intently on the success of their mining partnerships. Families were central. Women raised food, took in boarders, and often worked outside the household. Their income provided financial stability to support the bust and boom work of men in the mines. Male children often labored with their fathers. These households themselves reproduced faith in the success of the poor man's camp ideal. When one family hit pay dirt, they gave confidence to their neighbors, people just like them, that they could do it too. Miners embraced the speculative nature of this work. In 1859, one called leasehold mining a, quote, a slave's life. Not because it bound his body, but because the possibilities gripped his mind. He explained that he often, quote, obtained no reward for many days, and again cleared $150 a week, but was unable to content himself in any other pursuit. This appeal of chance, of risk and reward on one's own behalf, impelled the dramatic process of discovery as newcomers explored undeveloped ground. Each time these prospectors found new, rich deposits, They reaffirmed the idea of the poor man's camp as the leading edge of that camp gradually expanded. From Granby to Oronogo to Joplin to Webb City and Carterville to Aurora, Hells Neck, Zinkite, on and on and on. This way, prospectors working on their own accord uncovered a wide swath of ore deposits that ran through 3 Missouri counties, into Kansas in the 1870s, and into Indian Territory in the 1890s. They were keen to defend the terms of the poor man's camp. Success attracted small-time investors from St. Louis and Kansas City who purchased mining land in the 1870s. Rather than mine it themselves, they kept the pre-existing leasehold system, but tried to enforce stricter terms. In 1872, miners in Joplin, which was a new town then emerging as the district center, met to defend their claims. And in that meeting, in some ways, their resolutions looked a lot like those of contemporary mining unions. They emphasized the rights of working miners and future prospectors against land speculators who sought to impose more restrictive leasehold contracts. They wanted to maintain control and access. They justified those rights, however, in terms that reflected their embrace of market incentives. And in this they depart, I think, from organized workers elsewhere. As one resolution pronounced, quote, "It was the duty of the miner, the duty, to sell his mineral to the man who will pay the highest price for it." That's a weird way to think about duty, I think. And I think we rarely hear about workers who think about duty this way, but it was hard to argue with. Their defense, though, was only partially successful. By 1880, investors had tightened leasehold agreements on the production of lead, which was easier to smelt locally, while miners retained the right to sell zinc ore freely for open market prices. The zinc ore was more plentiful, but it was harder to smelt and thus less valuable, but nevertheless, miners retained that important right to sell it freely. Their pursuit of zinc ore in response made much more sense for them suddenly to pursue zinc over lead, would help give the zinc boom of the 1880s and 90s its momentum. Southwest Missouri miners pursued these incentives with a ferocity that shocked many observers. In 1879, the new Missouri Commissioner of Labor Statistics criticized the, quote, strange, confused appearance of the district settlements, where, quote, the yawning mouths of the shafts are at every hand, and the little box-like miners' cottages nestled about and among the huge piles of debris. It seems hard to have women and children surrounded by such chaos, he said. Perhaps the men do not care, because the quest for mineral becomes all-absorbing. It's not clear whether women shared his judgment, however. 10 years later, the state mine inspector found the same conditions. Quote, savings which could certainly buy a comfortable home are dumped into holes in the ground, which possibly may result in gains of thousands, but which probably and generally result in the loss of all. The absorbing quest for mineral disrupted early efforts by labor unions to organize in the district. The Knights of Labor, which would become the largest union in the United States in the 1880s, sent several organizers to the burgeoning tri-state district with little success. One organizer, a man named John Loftus, who came actually from Stilson, Kansas. He was a coal miner, unionized coal miner. He was actually converted to the ethic of the poor man's camp rather than converting the poor man's camp to the Knights of Labor. He started prospecting, lost interest in the union, and explained to Terence Powderly, the national leader of the Knights of Labor, quote, a man may be poor here one day and rich the next. Even state mining officials seemed to lose their nerve around Joplin. Two successive inspectors in the late 1880s refused to enforce the state's mine safety law because it would, quote, hinder or injure our poorer class of miners who could not afford the required measures. Strict enforcement, the inspectors said, would be, quote, death to them. By then, most tri-state miners saw both unions and labor laws as irrelevant to their interests. They had little reason from their own practical experience and that of their neighbors to conclude otherwise. Indeed, most miners could not conceive of alternatives even when their chances dwindled. In the 1890s, small companies had grown. Compare this one to that earlier Granby mine lithograph. To exploit the plentiful supplies of zinc, which earned them far less per weight than lead, but could be traded at open market prices, which we know, I mentioned yesterday, zinc prices rise continually for 20 straight years. These companies leased more ground, used more machines, employed more wage laborers. The owner-operators of the poor man's camp were gradually becoming owner-employers, but on a small scale, still considered crude in other mining districts. In 1904, for example, there were over 500 separate mining companies in southwest Missouri, most employing from 2 to 8 wage laborers. In this context, opportunities for prospectors dwindled. Although hundreds of men worked for wages in the day and on their own claims by night. They did so with continued confidence that increasingly seemed pathological to some. In 1889, the mine inspector met a miner who worked like this for over a decade. He had saved, quote, his wages, expecting that at last the next prospecting will prove a bonanza. He is as poor now as when he began, but is rich in anticipations. This inspector blamed what he's considered such irrational behavior on a, quote, gambling spirit, a specter that haunted many Americans fearful of capitalist excess. Even miners who wanted out imagined success as the only means of escape. As one explained in 1888, quote, the only hope for a miner is to strike a good lead and quit mining. The second key to understanding Southwest Missouri miners is that at this moment, when the poor man's camp ideal was dying in reality, they redoubled their faith in it through conflict with other miners who looked at capitalism very differently, and who looked and sounded different to them. The national mining industry changed dramatically in the 1890s through economic integration, technological advances, and the arrival of new waves of immigrants. Miners in Southwest Missouri felt these changes negatively in their own new dependence on wages and reduced prospecting opportunities. The coal mining strike in Kansas is an early example of this, which shut down zinc smelters and closed the purchase of zinc ore in the Tri-State. I can talk more about that later, but it's an example of the way industrial changes in the nature and practice of mining are bearing down on Tri-State miners. But these changes also created new opportunities for risky, high-paying work as strikebreakers on behalf of massive mining corporations against radical mining unions. Across the West in the 1890s, union miners, many of them foreign-born, led by the new Western Federation of Miners, fought back with strikes to reclaim control and power from mining corporations. Those corporations, beginning in Leadville, Colorado in 1896, recruited strikebreakers in Southwest Missouri, where engineers trained at Washington University in St. Louis knew there were no unions and expected the region's white native-born men to have no sympathies with the foreign-born miners in the Western Federation. In this process, Joplin miners learned that being white, native-born, and non-union attracted incentives, financial incentives from employers, and came to see the union as an adversary and a threat to their privileges as white American men. Southwest Missouri miners approached strikebreaking as they did the old leasehold contracts. From the start in Leadville, they negotiated terms on transportation costs, on pay, and for their ability to hold the jobs if the strike ended, all under the protection of the Colorado National Guard. This is a scene with Colorado National Guard member and the stockade protecting Joplin strikebreakers at the Emmett mine. Although not sad about replacing union miners, they first justified the decision in terms of family necessity because of lack of work due to the Depression of the 1890s. Miner Scott McCollum explained, quote, "If we could have got work at home, every one of us would be in Joplin today. If a man is a man, he will do the best he can by his wife and little ones." Still, McCollum admitted, quote, "It's the money I'm after." The defeat of the Leadville Union, however, turned this temporary option into an ongoing advantage, an ongoing opportunity wherever the union went on strike. As the Western Federation grew more radical and confrontational after Leadville, Joplin miners got new opportunities for strike breaking that in turn further exacerbated the growing enmity between them and the union. As this conflict cascaded, they recast themselves as free economic agents. They began to denounce unions and strikes for unjustly preventing them from working. They increasingly explained this thinking in terms of race, nativity, and their physical power as men. Hope you can see those sites where Joplin strikebreakers went this 15-year period. During the 1890 strike in northern Idaho, Joplin miners touted the absence of unions at home to create their demand for their work as strikebreakers. They also emphasized to anyone who asked that they were white Americans. One explained in a letter to relatives to Joplin, reprinted in the Joplin News Herald, that there were good-paying jobs in Idaho for miners who, quote, want to work and want to make money. All they had to do was sign a paper that said they were, quote, American-born and belonged to no union. To him, the two were almost synonymous, and the deal a clear winner. Quote, now, if that takes away a man's liberty, being American and non-union, then mine is gone. In other words, free white American men could and should work when and where they wanted. Many strikebreakers indulge this rising nationalist feeling through physical violence. We go where we please, one strikebreaker wrote home in 1899, and if a man calls us scab, we knock him down. This aggression was partly in response to union denunciations, rooted in a rival idea of manly solidarity, that derided scabs as physically and mentally unfit. In union parlance, Joplin miners were, quote, flatfoots, brute spirits, degenerates, a potent word that suggested racial inferiority. It was said in Colorado that strike-breaking miners from Missouri had to be shown how to work. They were bad miners, a shame for any skilled worker. And the taunt that union miners lobbed at them seemed to stick. Show me, boss. I'll do anything you want, boss, just show me. But violence, shaded by racial nationalism, also assured Joplin miners that their advantage as strike-breaking, native-born white men lay in destroying unions of what they considered work-shy foreigners. According to a marching song strikebreakers sang in South Dakota in 1910, quote, here's to the man from old Mizzou. If the home state company sticks by him, he'll surely pull her through. There'll be no strikes nor walkouts, no grievances to tell. For being white and human, he knows when he's treated well. This antagonism pushed the Western Federation toward an ever more radical strategy that led to its split from the American Federation of Labor in 1905 to the formation of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. It also pushed miners who remained in Southwest Missouri toward a full-blown public anti-unionism. Both the Western Federation and the more conservative AFL would try and fail to organize there after 1900, although a small minority of tri-state miners did join, very small. A Western Federation organizer said he failed in Joplin because the miners there, quote, had a lack of dignity and utter disregard for their welfare and that of their fellows. One Southwest Missourian who joined the union apologized for his peers. Their selfishness, he said, quote, is bred in them and they can't help it. The third and final key to understanding Joplin miners is that they use these lessons learned in strike-breaking to turn wage work in Southwest Missouri into a speculative enterprise that used their own bodies as capital. They did this by embracing hazardous work so long as they were paid according to the market price of metal and by claiming control over these jobs as native-born, physically aggressive white men. Joplin miners adopted an oppositional stance against anyone who might limit those opportunities, including employers, especially the biggest mining company by the 19-teens, American Zinc. But this stance also hardened animosities against union allies and found new enemies in middle class and government reformers whose health and safety efforts threatened to constrain their risky, lucrative work. In response to a 1902 Missouri law mandating an 8-hour day in the mines, Joplin area miners and companies negotiated a new piece rate system for hand loaders, or shovelers. By 1910, shovelers made up 40% of all mine workers. They were essential as growing companies needed to move vast amounts of zinc ore to the surface. For young men, shoveling replaced prospecting as a route to high pay. Shovelers could earn between 4 and 8 cents for loading a can, each of which held between 800 and 1,200 pounds of material, depending on the mine. They used only their bodies and a simple number 2 scoop shovel. Each scoop held about 21 pounds of ore. Young men threw themselves into the work. The best among them shoveled 50,000 to 80,000 pounds a day, earning $4 or $5. This is in a context where Henry Ford's famed $5 day blew everyone's mind. Shovelers in Webb City, the best of them are earning that on a daily basis. Some shovelers even hired assistant shovelers, subleasing the shoveling on a subcontract basis, or employed children, which allowed them to meet performance bonuses. Although many shovelers were single, women continued to supply food and housing that kept them alive and thriving above ground, either as wives, mothers, or more importantly, as boarding house hosts. Once shovelers became too old, they took less demanding mine jobs, often prospecting on the side. But shovelers quickly became famous for their physical power. They are stout, the News Herald reported, and are possessed of that reckless nature characteristic of the country boy. By turning a once common job into something like skilled work, they earn respect as exemplars of white native-born masculinity. The Joplin Globe held a contest to discover the best shoveler of all in 1907. A man named Lynn Smith won the $50 prize and $13 in wages by filling 303 cans weighing more than 257,000 pounds in a single 8-hour shift. Just his arms and his back and his shovel. Smith told reporters that he could, quote, out-shovel any man in the district and was willing to back that opinion with a liberal chunk of cash. He's ready for more. The Globe explained, quote, the shoveler is a typical man, an American, whose genius, that's their word, genius combined brain, nerve, and muscle to literally move mountains. The Webb City Register, meanwhile, boasted that, quote, Southwest Missouri shovelers are intelligent Anglo-Saxons. Seen this way, the Joplin shoveler embodied President Theodore Roosevelt's strenuous life. Fearful that white American men were becoming weak and over-civilized, Roosevelt and other nationalists urged them to assert themselves physically, even with violence. In 1907, a mining engineer challenged anyone with such worries to come to Southwest Missouri and, quote, see what the white laborer working on contract can still accomplish. Fancy a white man shoveling 50 tons per day in an 8-hour shift, he wrote. Marvel. Soon, however, shovelers sought to exert that power against their employers. The best, who were deemed in local parlance, quote, fancy shovelers, were in high demand. They roved across the district seeking higher piece rates, which caused frequent labor shortages that halted production. One shoveler responded to an editorial complaint about their pay with cold entrepreneurial logic. When metal prices went up, he said, quote, we want our advance in wages. They started talking about their bodies as, quote, capital. Ultimately, they negotiated contract terms that tied the piece rate of shoveling to the market price of zinc, a clear link to the old jug handle leasehold contract system. They also continued to take lucrative strike-breaking work. Some even started suing their employers for workplace injuries, seeking compensation for lost earning potential. Local elites soon considered the shovelers actually a problem. One company official said that they were, quote, the nearest to beasts of any men he had ever managed. When companies tried to lower piece rates, hire foreign labor, or experiment with machine loaders, shovelers pushed back with slowdowns, walkouts, and physical intimidation on the streets, ironically mimicking union tactics. According to one, quote, we have helped to build this mining center, and we are proud of it, and we won't see any Italian trash come in here and reap the benefits. Any contradiction with the district's history of producing strikebreakers seemed lost on him. Happy to go break strikes elsewhere, not going to allow anyone to come in and interfere with their opportunities in Joplin. All the while, Joplin miners continued to reject union organizers. Between 1910 and 1915, they refused repeated overtures from the Western Federation of Miners because, one shoveler explained, it was full of, quote, hunkies who would rather strike than work. This is a white man's camp, another said of Joplin. Down with the foreigner. The social costs of this stance were high, since the union supported attempts by local public health officials to combat growing problems with occupational lung disease. Shovelers inhaled vast amounts of dust, especially in the sheet ground mines. One can imagine shoveling that much, the amount of respiration you need, sucking silica-rich chert dust deep into their mines, which caused silicosis and aggravated tuberculosis. Those afflicted lived less than 10 years. One study showed in the 19-teens that half of miners in the district suffered from one or both affliction. One doctor surmised that the district in that period led the nation in widowhood. Because of the proposed solutions, watering down the rock piles, wearing a mask, threatened shoveler productivity, miners rejected them. Their pursuit of piece rates gave them oppositional power, but with no allies, gave them short-term gains, but no long-term certainty. With the Great War boosting zinc prices to record levels and encouraging white nationalist fervor nationwide, they embraced piece rate shoveling with a new zeal in Joplin and Webb City and in the new boom camp of the 19-teens, Pittsburg, Oklahoma. The Great War changed the calculus of tri-state miners, but not the goals. Between 1916 and 1919, federal repression of labor and political radicals, especially in the Western Federation, federal appeals to patriotic nationalism, federal restriction of immigration, and demand for American metal created new conditions for labor unions to start to take root in the tri-state district. Organizers from the American Federation of Labor and its state affiliate in Oklahoma successfully organized locals in the 1920s, but union demands still bore the imprint of local mining culture, especially of the shovelers. They wanted more immigration restriction, and they wanted a firmer guarantee of market-based sliding scale contracts for wage workers. In the early 1930s, these locals gained new momentum from New Deal union protections, but remained a minority. They went on strike in 1935 over low wages, over mine shutdowns, and the medical efforts of mining companies in league with the Bureau of Mines and insurance companies to exclude sick or injured from mining work. That strike started something like a civil war. Non-union tri-state miners, goaded by the companies, revived past strike-breaking traditions to break a strike of their neighbors in their own front yard, using violence to do so. This is an infamous pick-handle mob that is just about to attack the union office in Galena, Kansas in April 1937. It would not be until the 1940s that unions finally organized the district. The first union contract in the tri-state district was January 1942, and that came about through the combined power of the National War Labor Board and the carrot of wartime federal subsidies for marginal metal producers. By the 1940s, the tri-state district was considered marginal producers. And ironically, those unions would actually outlive the mines that closed in rapid succession in the late 1940s and 1950s. Brings us to our conclusion. The story of Joplin miners, tri-state miners, their rejection of unions and collective efforts to ensure health and safety can only be understood when we consider them as creative agents whose decisions and actions across generations reflected a logic of self-interest, both material and idealistic, that they themselves created. It reveals, I contend, a deep tradition of working-class conservatism, beginning in the age of Jackson, made by white men who identified their interests with the acquisitive market functions of capitalism and the social and political privileges of their race, nativity, and gender. As an ideal, that tradition offered poor white men a good chance to share the national prosperity through hard work, and in turn uphold manly and paternal responsibilities. In practice, amid many obstacles, it encouraged working-class white men, particularly the native-born, to pursue narrowing economic opportunities through reckless physical action and often violent assertions of racial and nativist advantage. As much as larger structural forces influenced and elites took advantage of that tradition, multiple generations of miners sustained and shaped it in dynamic ways through their own choices against often compelling alternatives offered by unions of all stripes, by social reformers, political allies of the labor movement. They make these decisions in the face of compelling alternatives again and again across generations. This is important. Far from ignorant pawns or just plain bad people, they acted consciously and consistently for decades according to their own interests and faith in capitalism as they understood it. Those decisions created great wealth and proud communities that still exist. The great irony and indeed tragedy is that those decisions also destroyed the efforts of other miners elsewhere to improve their living and working conditions, and in the tri-state district yielded a future of early death, widespread poverty,